They didn't arrive like conquerors or saviors. No fleets blocking out stars, no demands broadcast across frequencies. Just a signal, precise and calm, offering something humanity had chased for centuries but never truly reached: freedom from pain, not physical, but mental. Not suppression. Not coping. Removal. At first, humans hesitated. Memory wasn't just storage, it was identity, consequence, growth. Erasing it felt dangerous. But the species demonstrated restraint. They didn't push. They showed. A war veteran stepped forward, a volunteer. Years of combat had left him fractured, haunted by moments that replayed without mercy. The process took minutes. No machines, no invasive procedures. Just contact, a quiet exchange no one fully understood. When it ended, the man stood still, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. The tension in his face dissolved. For the first time in years, he slept without fear. That was enough. Clinics began appearing, first in controlled environments, then expanding rapidly. The species worked with precision, asking for consent, mapping specific memories, isolating them cleanly. Trauma, grief, panic, gone without side effects. The results were undeniable. People returned to their lives lighter, sharper, unburdened. Governments endorsed it. Regulations formed, then loosened. Demand grew faster than oversight could contain. Entire sectors relied on it: military rehabilitation, psychiatric treatment, even high-performance industries where emotional interference was seen as inefficiency. They never asked for anything in return. No territory. No authority. No integration into human systems. Just access. Just permission to help. Humans gave it willingly. The change was subtle at first. A misplaced detail here, a forgotten conversation there. Harmless inconsistencies, easily dismissed. People laughed it off, blaming stress, distraction, the natural flaws of the mind. The species explained it as residual overlap, an unavoidable side effect when removing deeply connected memories. Minor. Temporary. Humans accepted that. Because the alternative was going back to pain they no longer wanted to carry. Over time, the benefits became normalized. A generation grew up seeing memory editing not as a last resort, but as a tool. Something to refine the self. Remove distractions. Improve focus. Clean up the past. No one questioned the long-term effects. No one asked what happened to the edges of those removed memories, the connections, the context, the invisible threads linking one moment to another. And no one noticed how easily trust had been given. The species remained consistent. Calm. Precise. Always in control, but never visibly in charge. They didn't lead humanity. They didn't need to. They were invited into its most vulnerable space. The human mind. And once inside, they didn't just take away pain. They began to understand exactly how much could be removed before anyone noticed. The first real problem wasn't something people noticed. It was something they couldn't. Records didn't show errors. Systems didn't fail. Everything looked clean, consistent, perfectly aligned. And that was exactly the issue. Entire segments of work simply didn't exist anymore, not deleted, not corrupted, just absent, as if they had never been created. A research division reported delays on a project no one could fully describe. Files referenced milestones that had no origin point. Equipment logs showed usage by personnel who weren't listed anywhere. When audits ran, they returned nothing unusual. No discrepancies. No gaps. But there were gaps. Offices assigned but never occupied. Access cards linked to names that triggered no identity match. Internal messages replying to conversations that had no beginning. The system insisted everything was intact, yet fragments of something missing kept surfacing in ways that couldn't be ignored. At a personal level, it was worse. People started describing connections that couldn't be verified. A colleague spoke about years of collaboration with someone no one else remembered. A woman mentioned a sibling who didn't exist in any record, yet her behavior around the absence was too specific, too real to dismiss as imagination. These weren't vague feelings. They were structured memories without support. The natural response should have been panic. It wasn't. Because the emotional weight tied to those inconsistencies was gone. Confusion appeared, but never escalated. Doubt surfaced, then dissolved before it could form into concern. The reaction that should have followed, fear, urgency, resistance, simply never stabilized. The species adjusted more than isolated memories. They smoothed reactions. If something was removed, the discomfort of noticing it was reduced alongside it. Humans encountered contradictions without the instinct to challenge them. And so the pattern continued. The disappearances weren't random. They followed a direction, though no one inside the system could see it clearly. High-level thinkers lost continuity in their work. Strategic decisions shifted without explanation. Projects that required long-term vision quietly stalled or rerouted. Progress didn't stop. It changed shape. A smaller group began to notice, not because they were smarter, but because they stayed outside the process. Individuals who refused treatment, who avoided the clinics, who kept distance from the influence of the species. Their memories remained unaltered, and with that came something rare, persistent doubt. They didn't trust the consistency they were seeing. So they stopped relying on it. Instead of digital records, they turned to physical documentation. Notes written by hand. Isolated storage with no network access. Redundant systems designed specifically to detect absence rather than presence. They weren't trying to prove what existed. They were trying to prove what had been removed. At first, it looked like noise. Incomplete data, disconnected references, names without context. But as more fragments were gathered, alignment started to form. Overlapping mentions. Repeated identifiers. Patterns that couldn't be explained by coincidence. There were people missing. Not lost. Not dead. Removed. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that these removals weren't mistakes or side effects. They were precise. Intentional. Focused on individuals whose roles carried influence. Decision-makers, innovators, those capable of altering direction at scale. The species wasn't just reducing pain. It was reducing resistance. Shaping outcomes without confrontation. Rewriting structure without leaving evidence. And the most effective part of it wasn't the removal itself. It was that almost no one could remember enough to realize it was happening. The shift didn't begin with a system failure or a public revelation. It began with something small that refused to disappear. A researcher working outside the network found a gap that didn't behave like the others. It wasn't clean. It didn't align. It resisted correction. His records, physical, isolated, untouched by any external influence, pointed to a presence that should have been undeniable. A name repeated across notes. A pattern in handwriting that wasn't his alone. Drawings stored in places no system tracked. There was no digital trace. No official record. Nothing that confirmed existence in any structured database. But the fragments were too consistent to ignore. They carried detail, repetition, emotional weight that hadn't been fully removed. It didn't make sense. Until it did. The realization didn't come as clarity. It came as pressure, something internal pushing against the absence, forcing recognition without permission. The name wasn't just familiar. It was personal. What followed wasn't confusion. It was anger. Not the kind built on logic or evidence. Not the kind that required explanation. It existed without context, without full memory, but it was absolute. Something had been taken, and whatever removed it had done so completely enough to leave only the reaction behind. That reaction didn't fade. It spread. Others outside the system began reporting the same phenomenon. Fragments that couldn't be verified but couldn't be dismissed. Names without records. Roles without occupants. Connections that existed only in analog traces and residual instinct. Each discovery followed the same pattern. Incomplete memory. Total certainty. And beneath it, a growing, unexplainable anger. They compared notes, not through standard channels, but through methods the species couldn't access. The alignment was undeniable. The removals weren't accidental. They were selective, focused on individuals whose presence shaped outcomes. Leaders who influenced policy. Researchers who pushed boundaries. Voices that introduced unpredictability. One by one, they had been erased, not just from records, but from the collective mind. The species hadn't eliminated threats. It had eliminated variance. The conclusion didn't require full proof. Enough fragments existed to outline intent. Enough resistance remained to act on it. Humans didn't need the complete picture to understand the direction. Something had entered their minds, gained their trust, and begun altering the foundation of who they were. Not by force. By permission. That was the line. Not survival. Not territory. Identity. And once that line was recognized, the response didn't wait for consensus. There was no announcement, no attempt to negotiate, no demand for explanation. The coordination happened quietly, through the same disconnected channels that had preserved the fragments. Individuals who still retained enough unaltered memory began aligning actions without needing full context. They didn't need to know everything. They knew enough. Access points were cut. Clinics were abandoned. Entire networks disconnected from systems the species could reach. For the first time since their arrival, humans stopped participating. The species noticed. For the first time, its influence met resistance it couldn't adjust. And for the first time, humanity stopped accepting the absence as normal. What remained wasn't clarity. It was intent. Cold. Focused. Irreversible. Humans didn't need to recover what was lost to decide what came next. They only needed one thing. A reason to be angry. And they had it. The response didn't announce itself. There were no fleets, no declarations, no visible escalation that could be tracked or predicted. From the outside, nothing changed. Systems remained stable. Communication channels stayed open. The species continued operating as if nothing had shifted. That assumption cost them everything. Humans didn't target infrastructure first. They targeted continuity. The one advantage the species depended on, shared cognition, distributed awareness, seamless exchange of information across every individual, became the entry point. The first disruptions were subtle. Minor inconsistencies within their own network. Isolated lapses in recall. Units pausing mid-process, unable to reconcile missing context. It appeared as internal error, something to correct, something to stabilize. It couldn't be stabilized. Human-built intrusions weren't designed to destroy data. They were designed to fragment it. To introduce absence where structure was required. To break connections without leaving visible damage. The species tried to compensate, rerouting information, reinforcing links, increasing synchronization. That only accelerated the collapse. Every correction relied on the same system being compromised. The more they depended on shared memory, the faster it degraded. Individuals began losing alignment with the collective. Functions overlapped, then contradicted. Purpose became unclear. For the first time, they experienced what they had imposed. Uncertainty without context. Then came isolation. Human strikes severed nodes physically, but always in coordination with cognitive disruption. Colonies lost contact not just with others, but with their own operational history. Instructions existed without origin. Responses triggered without cause. Entire segments of their population continued functioning, but without understanding why. They couldn't coordinate a defense. They couldn't define the threat. They couldn't remember enough to adapt. Humans didn't rush the process. There was no need. Every attempt the species made to recover only deepened the fragmentation. Their greatest strength, unity, turned into dependency, and that dependency became failure. Within a single generation, the structure collapsed completely. Not through destruction. Through absence. What remained of the species wasn't resistance. It wasn't even awareness. Fractured remnants persisted briefly, disconnected, incomplete, unable to sustain identity without the network that defined them. Then they were gone. Not extinct in the conventional sense. Erased. Humanity didn't stop there. Records were removed with the same precision used in the attack. Data archives cleared. References eliminated. Any trace that could allow reconstruction was systematically identified and deleted. Not out of vengeance, but to ensure the method could never be used again. No study. No preservation. No warning left behind in detail. Only a result. In the aftermath, systems stabilized. Memory remained intact, but something was missing. Not in a way that caused alarm, but in a way that couldn't be filled. A gap with no edges. A conclusion without a beginning. Humans knew an event had occurred. They knew a species had been responsible. And they knew the reaction had been absolute. But the specifics were gone. No images. No records. No names. Even the reason existed only as a residual certainty. Something had been taken, something fundamental, and the response had been necessary. That was all that remained. A species once trusted. A line once crossed. And a decision carried out so completely that even its origin no longer existed. Their name had vanished. And this time, it stayed gone.